Captain Derek Hammond stood frozen in the cockpit doorway, his face drained of all color. The black woman he'd just humiliated and refused to fly with now held documents that would destroy everything he'd built in 20 years. She smiled coldly and said 5 words that shattered his world. "I own this entire airline." His knees buckled as security approached. Before we dive into this incredible story of justice and transformation, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in second chances and accountability, smash that like button right now. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. Let's get started. Derek Hammond woke at 5:30 that morning in his penthouse apartment overlooking Buckhead, Atlanta's most prestigious neighborhood. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city, still draped in pre-dawn darkness, lights twinkling like scattered diamonds across the urban landscape. He stood at those windows with his first cup of coffee, black and strong, watching the world slowly come to life beneath him. After 20 years as a commercial pilot, 12 of those following a distinguished career in the United States Air Force, Derek had earned this view, this life, this respect. At 52 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and the confident bearing of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world, Derek Hammond was exactly where he believed he deserved to be. He was the most senior captain at Skybridge Airways, the face of the airline in promotional materials, the pilot that first-class passengers requested by name. His uniform hung perfectly, pressed in his closet, his flight bag packed with military precision, his reputation spotless as fresh snow. This morning should have been like any other, a routine international flight to London with a crew he knew and trusted, carrying 240 passengers who would never know the skill required to deliver them safely across the deck. Atlantic. But fate, Derek would soon learn, had other plans entirely. He moved through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed these same actions thousands of times. Shower, shave, dress in the crisp white shirt and navy trousers that marked him as a captain. He fixed himself breakfast, scrambled eggs, and whole wheat toast ate, while scanning the newspaper, barely registering the headlines about social justice movements and calls for diversity in corporate America. Derek skimmed past those articles with faint irritation, the same irritation he felt whenever people talked about lowering standards to accommodate what he privately called political correctness. In his mind, aviation was a meritocracy, a field where skill and experience were all that mattered, where the best rose to the top regardless of anything else. That he himself was a white man who'd benefited from networks and opportunities not equally available to everyone never crossed his mind as anything other than the natural order of things. He believed in hard work and earning your place, and he believed he'd earned his through dedication and talent alone. By 6:45, Derek was in his Mercedes driving through Atlanta's early morning traffic toward Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The radio played softly, a news program discussing changes in the airline industry, new federal guidelines about diversity and hiring initiatives to increase representation of women and minorities in cockpits across America. Derek turned the volume down, muttering under his breath about quotas and the erosion of standards. He'd heard the complaints from other senior pilots, mostly men like himself, about how the industry was changing how someone's identity seemed to matter more than their qualifications these days. Derek didn't consider himself prejudiced, would have been offended if anyone suggested such a thing, but he held firm beliefs about natural hierarchies and who truly belonged in positions of responsibility and authority. Those beliefs formed in childhood in rural Alabama during the 1970s, reinforced through decades in predominantly white male spaces in the military and aviation, sat so deep in his psyche that he no longer even recognized them as beliefs, rather than simple facts about how the world worked. He arrived at the airport at 7:15, parking in the reserved section for flight crew, walking through the employee entrance with the badge that granted him access to areas passengers never saw. Other crew members greeted him with deference, calling him Captain Hammond, asking about his previous flights, treating him with the respect he'd grown accustomed to expecting. Derek moved through these interactions smoothly, a man comfortable in his domain, secure in his status. He grabbed another coffee from the crew lounge, checked the flight board to confirm his assignment, London Heathrow departing at 9:30 gate, a 17 aircraft tail number, November 7-8, Bravo. Everything appeared normal routine, exactly as it should be. He looked for his usual First Officer Brent Sullivan, a 45-year-old pilot he'd flown with dozens of times, someone Derek trusted because Brent never questioned Derek's decisions and shared his views on most things, including the unspoken understanding about who really belonged in a cockpit. But when Derek entered the operations area at 8:15 to begin his pre-flight preparations, he noticed something odd in the way the scheduling coordinator avoided making eye contact. The young man, fresh-faced and nervous, shuffled papers on his desk and cleared his throat twice before speaking.
"Captain Hammond, there's been a change to your crew assignment," he said, voice carefully neutral.
Derek's eyebrows rose slightly more annoyed than concerned. Changes happened, people called in sick, emergencies arose, but Derek preferred consistency and predictability. "What kind of change?" he asked, his tone clipped. The coordinator glanced at his computer screen. First Officer Sullivan reported ill early this morning, stomach flu, unable to fly. "We've assigned you a replacement, fully qualified current, on the Boeing 787 Dreamliner International Certification Excellent record." Derek waited for the name, but the coordinator seemed reluctant to provide it, and Derek prompted, "First Officer Naomi Caldwell." The young man finally said, "She'll be here shortly." The pronoun registered first, she. Derek felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He had nothing against female pilots in principle, had flown with several over the years, and found them competent enough, though he privately believed women lacked the natural aptitude for handling emergencies that men possessed through some competent biological advantage he couldn't quite articulate, but felt certain existed. Still, he could work with a woman if necessary, as long as she followed his lead and didn't try to prove anything. "Where's she coming from?" Derek asked, meaning which base, which department. The coordinator hesitated again. "She's been assigned from executive operations, special assignment from upper management." That phrase, special assignment, triggered Derek's suspicions immediately. It sounded like corporate maneuvering, like someone's pet project, like exactly the kind of diversity initiative he resented. But he said nothing more, just nodded curtly and moved to the briefing room to review the flight plan, weather reports, fuel calculations, and passenger manifest. The flight was full, every seat occupied, including several business executives in first class and a group of students heading to London for a study abroad program. It was the kind of flight that required smooth professional execution, no room for error or uncertainty, and Derek found himself already resenting this First Officer Caldwell for disrupting his usual routine and forcing him to work with someone he didn't know. At 8:45, Derek was reviewing the aircraft maintenance logs when he sensed, rather than heard, someone enter the briefing room. He looked up and felt his entire body go rigid. Standing in the doorway was a black woman, late 30s tall and lean, with an athletic build, her hair pulled back in neat braids, wearing a perfectly fitted pilot's uniform with first officer stripes on her shoulders and wings pinned above her left breast pocket. She carried herself with quiet confidence, rolling a professional flight bag behind her, her expression pleasant and professional. For a fraction of a second, Derek's brain stuttered, unable to reconcile the image before him with his ingrained expectations of what a co-pilot should look like. Then, his defenses slammed into place, his biases activating so automatically he didn't even recognize them as such. This had to be a mistake, some kind of error. Perhaps she was a flight attendant who'd walked into the wrong room, or maybe she worked in operations and was delivering a message. The idea that this woman was his assigned first officer struck him as almost absurd, triggering every prejudice he'd spent a lifetime accumulating and never examining. Naomi Caldwell stepped forward, professional smile in place, and extended her hand. "Good morning, Captain Hammond. I'm First Officer Naomi Caldwell. I'll be your co-pilot for today's London flight." Her voice was clear and confident, her handshake firm when Derek automatically reflexively took her hand for the briefest possible moment before pulling away. Up close, he could see the absolute professionalism in her appearance, the precise way her uniform was worn, the competence evident in how she'd organized her materials, but none of that registered through the filter of his biases. All Derek saw was someone who didn't belong, someone who must have been assigned to this flight through affirmative action or diversity quotas or whatever corporate social engineering was fashionable this year, someone who would need constant supervision and wouldn't measure up to his standards. The thought never occurred to him that these judgments formed in less than 5 seconds, based solely on her appearance, revealed far more about his own limitations than hers. Derek withdrew his hand from Naomi's greeting and took an almost imperceptible step backward, creating distance between them that felt deliberate and cold. His eyes traveled over her in a way that wasn't about assessment of professionalism, but about finding confirmation for conclusions he'd already reached. Naomi recognized that look immediately, had seen it countless times throughout her career, the expression of someone judging her not by her credentials or capabilities, but by her appearance alone. She'd learned long ago to keep her face neutral when encountering such reactions to maintain her professionalism, even when others abandoned theirs, but beneath that calm exterior anger simmered. Not the hot flash of rage, but the cold, controlled fury of someone who'd fought against prejudice for decades and developed strategies for dealing with it. What Derek didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that this time, his prejudice had targeted someone with the power to hold him accountable in ways he couldn't imagine. Derek's first words to her dripped with condescension. "You have experience on the 787 Dreamliner." His tone suggested he already doubted the answer, already assumed she'd be unqualified or marginally trained. Naomi kept her voice level and professional. 8,200 hours total flight time, Captain, with 5,000 of those on the Boeing 787 specifically. I've flown this exact aircraft configuration on international routes for the past 4 years. The numbers should have impressed any reasonable pilot, should have immediately established her as highly experienced, but Derek's expression barely changed except for a slight narrowing of his eyes. International experience, he pressed, as if trying to catch her in exaggeration. Over 3,000 hours on transatlantic and transpacific routes, Naomi responded, maintaining eye contact. I hold an airline transport pilot license with full international certification type ratings on 5 different aircraft. And I completed advanced training at Flight Safety International just 3 months ago. She could have mentioned her decade in the Air Force, flying fighter jets, could have mentioned the Distinguished Flying Cross she'd earned, could have mentioned that her credentials exceeded those of many captains, including Derek himself, but she chose to provide only what was necessary, waiting to see how far his prejudice would take him. Derek waved his hand dismissively as if her qualifications were merely words on paper with no real meaning. Credentials don't always reflect actual capability, he said, the implication clear that he doubted she possessed the latter regardless of the former. In aviation, it's about instinct, decision-making under pressure, the kind of judgment that comes from real experience, not just checking boxes on a training form. The irony of his words suggesting that someone with 8,000 hours hadn't acquired real experience would have been laughable if it weren't so offensive. Naomi felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice steady. Captain Hammond, I assure you that my experience is quite real. I've handled emergency situations, severe weather, mechanical failures, and every scenario you can imagine. My safety record is spotless, and my proficiency evaluations have consistently rated excellent or above. She pulled out her tablet, prepared to show him her complete file, but Derek turned away before she could. I need to speak with the operations manager, Derek said abruptly, not to Naomi, but to the empty air, as if speaking directly to her would legitimize her presence. There's been some kind of mistake with crew assignments. Naomi's eyebrows rose slightly. Mistake, she asked, her tone still professional but with an edge now. What kind of mistake would that be? Captain Derek turned back to her, and for just a moment his mask slipped enough that his raw prejudice showed through. I specifically requested an experienced first officer for this flight. It's a full passenger load, important clients in first class, and I can't afford to babysit someone who's probably been pushed through training to meet some diversity quota. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their naked bigotry. A flight attendant who'd been passing in the hallway stopped, her eyes widening. The scheduling coordinator, who'd followed Naomi to the briefing room, stood frozen, clearly hearing what Derek had just said. Naomi felt the familiar burn of racial discrimination, the sting of being reduced to her skin color rather than recognized for her accomplishments, but she also felt something else, grim satisfaction. Because Derek Hammond had just revealed himself completely, and unlike the countless other times she'd faced such treatment, this time she had the power to respond in a way that would create lasting consequences. But not yet. Not quite yet. She wanted to see exactly how far he would go, wanted to document every word and action, wanted him to dig his hole so deep that there could be no question later about what had happened and why. So instead of revealing who she truly was, Naomi simply stood taller, looked Derek directly in the eyes, and said with ice-cold clarity, "Captain Hammond, I understand you may have concerns about flying with a new crew member. That's reasonable. But I am fully qualified for this assignment, and I'm prepared to demonstrate my capabilities in any way you require. Would you like to review my logbook, speak to my previous captain's test, my knowledge of procedures?" Derek's face flushed red. The fact that she remained so composed in the face of his disrespect seemed to infuriate him further, as if her competence itself was an affront to his worldview. "I don't have time for this," he snapped. "I'm going to operations, and I'm having you removed from this flight. Find someone else to mentor. I have 240 passengers whose safety I'm responsible for, and I won't compromise that responsibility for the sake of corporate politics." He brushed past Naomi's shoulder, nearly bumping hers in a gesture of dismissal and dominance, heading toward the operations office with the rigid posture of a man certain of his authority. Naomi remained standing in the briefing room, watching him go, her expression unreadable. The scheduling coordinator approached her cautiously. "Miss Caldwell, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with him. I can call someone from HR." Naomi held up one hand, stopping him. "Don't apologize for his behavior. You're not responsible for it. And don't call HR yet. Let's see how Captain Hammond wants to handle this situation. I suspect he's about to make it much, much worse for himself." Derek stormed into the operations office with the righteous fury of a man convinced he was protecting standards and safety rather than exposing his own prejudices. Philip Torres, the operations manager, looked up from his desk where he'd been coordinating gate assignments and crew schedules for the morning's departures. Philip was 58, a veteran of 25 years in airline operations, a man who'd seen every kind of crisis and personality conflict imaginable, but the expression on Derek's face warned him that something unusual was developing. "Philip, we need to talk now," Derek said, not bothering with pleasantries or preliminaries. Philip stood gesturing to the small conference room attached to his office. "Of course, Derek, what's the problem?" But Derek didn't move toward privacy. Instead, he stayed right where he was in the middle of the operations floor, where half a dozen other staff members were working, where his voice would carry, where his complaint would have an audience. "The problem is the first officer you assigned to my flight," Derek said, his voice loud enough that conversations around them stopped people turning to listen. "I don't know what kind of game corporate is playing, but I'm not participating. I need a qualified co-pilot, not some diversity hire who's probably never flown anything more challenging than a simulator." Philip's eyes widened in shock and alarm. He'd worked with Derek for years, knew the man had old-fashioned attitudes, but he'd never heard him speak so openly, so carelessly. "Derek, keep your voice down," Philip said, urgently moving toward him. "Let's discuss this privately." But Derek was too angry, too convinced of his own righteousness to exercise any caution. "No, this needs to be said out loud. For 20 years, I've maintained a perfect safety record. 20 years without incident, without complaint, flying millions of miles and carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. I've earned the right to choose who sits in my cockpit, and I'm telling you right now, I will not fly with that woman." The silence that followed those words was absolute. Everyone in operations had stopped working entirely, now staring at Derek with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Philip felt his heart sink, knowing that this situation had just escalated beyond anything he could quietly manage, knowing that policies and procedures and legal requirements would now come into play, whether Derek liked it or not. "Derek," Philip said carefully, trying one more time to defuse the situation. "First, Officer Caldwell has excellent qualifications. I reviewed her file myself. 8,000 hours, spotless record, current on all certifications. There's no reason." Derek cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I don't care what the paperwork says. I know exactly why she's here, and it's not because of merit." It's because some corporate executive wants to score points for having a black woman in the cockpit, wants to check off boxes on a diversity scorecard, wants good PR photos for the company website. Well, I won't be part of that charade. My responsibility is to safety, not social engineering. The word black, spoken with such contempt, made several people in the room physically recoil. There was no ambiguity now, no way to interpret Derek's objections as anything other than pure racial prejudice. Philip felt himself growing angry, felt his professional obligation to remain neutral, warring with his personal revulsion at what he was hearing. "Captain Hammond," he said, using Derek's title formally, now rather than his first name, "you are out of line." First Officer Caldwell was assigned based on qualifications and availability, period. Your personal opinions about diversity initiatives are irrelevant to this crew assignment. Derek's face went even redder. "My personal opinions. This isn't opinion, Philip. This is reality. Standards are being lowered to accommodate people who don't belong in these positions. I've seen it happening for years, watched as less qualified candidates get pushed through training because of their gender or race, while actually talented pilots get passed over. I won't compromise passenger safety for political correctness." Behind Derek, unnoticed by him in his fury, Naomi Caldwell had entered the operations area. She stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed face, calm but eyes burning with cold fire as she listened to every word. Several of the operations staff noticed her, their faces showing embarrassment and sympathy, but Derek was too focused on his argument with Philip to register the changed dynamics in the room. Philip saw Naomi, though, and his expression shifted to one of deep discomfort, knowing that she was hearing herself characterized as unqualified as a diversity hire, as someone who didn't belong. "Derek," Philip tried again, "you're making serious allegations without any foundation. First Officer Caldwell is standing right behind you, and I think you owe her." Derek spun around, finally noticing Naomi, but instead of embarrassment or apology, his expression showed only defiance. "Good, maybe you'll listen to reason even if Philip won't. I don't know you, I don't know your real capabilities beyond what's on paper, and I'm not willing to risk 240 lives finding out. Nothing personal, but I built my reputation on safety and judgment, and my judgment tells me this isn't going to work." Naomi walked forward slowly, deliberately, stopping about 6 feet from Derek. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Captain Hammond, let me be very clear about what's happening here. You looked at me and made immediate judgments about my capabilities based solely on my appearance. You assumed I was unqualified, assumed I was hired to fill a quota, assumed I don't belong in a cockpit, all without reviewing my credentials, speaking to my references, or giving me any opportunity to demonstrate my skills. That's not judgment, Captain. That's prejudice. That's racism." The word racism landed like a bomb. Derek's face went from red to almost purple. "How dare you?" he sputtered. "I am not a racist. This is about standards, about safety, about the fact that I'm a black woman," Naomi finished for him, her voice still eerily calm. "Because if I were a white man with identical credentials, we both know this conversation wouldn't be happening." Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with whether to continue denying what had become utterly transparent to everyone watching. Then his anger overrode whatever caution remained.
"Fine, you want the truth. The truth is, I don't trust that you earned your position through merit alone."
"The truth is, I've seen too many underqualified people promoted or hired because of their race or gender, while better candidates get ignored. The truth is, I will not put passenger safety at risk to make you or anyone else feel included." His voice had risen to nearly a shout by the end. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't react emotionally at all. She simply nodded slowly, as if Derek had confirmed something she'd already known. "Thank you for that honesty, Captain Hammond," she said. "At least now everyone knows exactly where you stand." She turned to Philip. "Mr. Torres, I'm formally requesting that you convene an emergency meeting with senior management to address Captain Hammond's refusal to fly with me based on racial discrimination." Philip nodded, looking relieved to have clear direction. "Of course, Miss Caldwell. I'll contact." And Philip, Naomi interrupted gently, "Please ensure that the meeting includes the full board of directors, all of them. I'll be making some announcements that require their presence." Philip looked confused. "The board, Miss Caldwell, with respect crew assignment disputes don't usually." Just make the calls, please, Naomi said, her tone leaving no room for argument despite her polite words. Something in her voice, some note of absolute authority, made Philip immediately reach for his phone. Derek watched this exchange with growing confusion and anger. "What is this?" he demanded. "You're going to run crying to management. Go ahead. I have 20 years of spotless service relationships with executives' union protection. You think you can intimidate me into accepting an unsafe crew assignment?" Naomi turned back to him, and for the first time she smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Captain Hammond, in 10 minutes you're going to wish you'd taken the time to ask who I actually am before you started talking. But it's too late now. You've made your position very clear, and I'm going to make sure everyone understands the consequences." Naomi pulled her phone from her pocket and stepped away from Derek, turning slightly for privacy as she made a call. Derek watched her with a mixture of confusion and contempt, convinced that whatever complaint she lodged would go nowhere, that his seniority and track record would protect him from any real consequences. He'd made complaints about other pilots before, had questioned their qualifications and suitability, and while HR had gone through the motions of investigation, nothing had ever come of it, because Derek Hammond was too valuable to the Cabrins. Airline, too respected, too established to be seriously challenged over what he considered legitimate professional concerns. He had no reason to believe this time would be any different, no understanding that the ground was already crumbling beneath his feet in ways he couldn't yet perceive. Philip Torres stood nearby, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone in executive management. His expression troubled. Other operation staff had abandoned any pretense of working and were openly watching the drama unfold, some with sympathy for Naomi, others with uncomfortable recognition that they'd witnessed something that couldn't be ignored or smoothed over. Naomi's call lasted less than 30 seconds. When she lowered the phone, her expression was composed, but her eyes held a glint of something that might have been satisfaction or might have been anticipation. She walked back to where Derek stood, his posture defensive and defiant, arms crossed over his chest. "Captain Hammond," Naomi said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather rather than his career-ending prejudice. "Before we proceed further, I'm curious about something. In your 20 years with Skybridge Airways, how many times have you filed formal complaints about a co-pilot's qualifications?" Derek's eyebrows drew together, suspicious of the question. "I don't see how that's relevant," he said. "Humor me," Naomi replied. "Surely you remember. Was it 3 times? 5, Derek's jaw tightened. "I've raised concerns when necessary, when safety required it. That's my responsibility as captain." 7 times, Naomi said softly. "You've filed 7 formal complaints questioning the qualifications or capabilities of assigned first officers. I've reviewed all 7 cases in detail, and I noticed something interesting. Would you like to know what I noticed?" Derek said nothing, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. How did this first officer have access to his personnel file, to records that should have been confidential, limited to management and HR? Naomi continued, her voice, still conversational, but with edges of steel underneath. "Every single one of those 7 complaints was about either a woman or a person of color. Every single one. In 20 years of flying with dozens of different co-pilots, you've never once questioned the qualifications of a white man, but you've filed formal complaints about every single woman and pilot of color you've been assigned." She paused, letting that information settle. "In 6 of those 7 cases, subsequent investigation found no merit to your concerns. The pilots you complained about had excellent records, met or exceeded all standards, and several went on to become captains themselves with outstanding careers. The 7th case was inconclusive, but also revealed no actual safety issues. Do you see the pattern, Captain Hammond? Because everyone else does." Derek felt heat crawling up his neck. Those complaints had been handled internally quietly, with assurances that they were confidential personnel matters. How was this woman accessing information that even most managers didn't have clearance to review? "Those records are private," he said, his voice tight. "You have no authorization to." "I have authorization for everything," Naomi interrupted quietly. "Every single record in this airline. Every file, every complaint, every personnel action, every financial document, because that's one of the benefits of ownership. The word hung in the air. Ownership. Derek stared at her blankly, not processing, not understanding. Philip Torres had gone completely still, phone still in his hand, eyes widening as pieces clicked into place that he should have seen earlier. Naomi pulled a folder from her flight bag, opened it, and held it so Derek could see the documents inside. Legal papers, stock certificates, transfer agreements, all bearing the letterhead of Skybridge Airways and the name Naomi Caldwell as primary shareholder and owner. 3 months ago, Naomi said, her voice carrying across the now silent operations area, I purchased Skybridge Airways through a private investment firm. The transaction was $580 million, making me the majority owner and giving me final authority over all operational and personnel decisions. The sale was kept confidential at my request because I wanted time to evaluate the company from the inside to understand its culture and operations before making my ownership public. She looked directly at Derek, her expression unreadable. I've spent the past 3 months reviewing every aspect of this airline, Captain Hammond. Every department, every policy, every personnel file. I know this company better than anyone because I've studied it with the thoroughness of someone who invested $500 million and intends to transform it into something better than it currently is. Derek's mind reeled, unable to process what he was hearing. This couldn't be true, had to be some elaborate bluff or joke or mistake. The owner of Skybridge was a reclusive investor, someone who worked through corporate representatives and lawyers, not someone who showed up in a pilot's uniform to fly commercial routes. You're lying, Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. Naomi smiled that cold smile again. Philip, would you confirm for Captain Hammond who I am? Philip swallowed hard, his face pale. I just spoke to Marcus Brennan's office. He's the CEO, Philip added, for Derek's benefit, though Derek knew perfectly well who the CEO was. His assistant confirmed that Miss Caldwell is indeed the owner of Skybridge Airways and that the entire board of directors is being convened for an emergency meeting in 15 minutes, as Miss Caldwell requested. Philip's voice shook slightly. She also indicated that my presence would be required at that meeting. Derek felt the floor tilt beneath him, felt his certainty and confidence draining away, like water through a sieve. No, this couldn't be happening, couldn't be real. He'd just spent the last 20 minutes publicly refusing to fly, with the owner of the airline had called her unqualified, and a diversity hire had essentially accused her of being incompetent based purely on her race. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to comment number 1 below if you agree with this. Do you think Derek Hammond deserves any sympathy at this point? Has he earned the disaster that's about to crash down on him? And here's what I'm really curious about. If you were in Naomi's position, what would you do next? Fire him immediately. Give him a chance to apologize. Something else entirely. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what Naomi actually decides will surprise you. And if you're invested in seeing justice served, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss how this plays out. Should Naomi show mercy or make an example of Derek? Let me know what you think, and let's continue this incredible story. Derek stood motionless as the implications crashed over him in waves, each one more devastating than the last. The owner. She was the owner. Every word he'd spoken, every dismissive gesture, every racist assumption had been directed at the one person in the entire company who had absolute power over his career, his reputation, his future. Around him, the operations staff were staring with expressions that ranged from shock to horrified fascination, watching a man destroy himself in real time through his own prejudice and arrogance. Derek's hands started to shake just slightly as his mind raced through everything he'd said, every accusation he'd made, every way he'd humiliated himself and revealed the ugly truth of his beliefs. 20 years of building a career, of cultivating a reputation, of positioning himself as the face of professional aviation excellence, and he'd demolished all of it in a single morning because he couldn't see past the color of a woman's skin. Philip Torres cleared his throat nervously. Captain Hammond, Miss Caldwell has requested that you attend the board meeting. It's not optional. His voice carried both sympathy and disapproval, the complicated emotions of someone watching a colleague self-destruct. Derek wanted to refuse, wanted to turn and walk out of the building, wanted to wake up and discover this was all a nightmare. but his legs wouldn't move. Some part of him, the part not paralyzed by shock and fear, understood that walking away now would only make things infinitely worse.
He'd already dug himself into a hole so deep he couldn't see daylight. Abandoning the situation entirely would be professional suicide. At least if he faced whatever was coming, he might.
Might what? Salvage something. Explain that it was all a misunderstanding. Convince people that his blatant racism was somehow justified or acceptable. Even in his panic, Derek recognized the futility of those hopes.
Naomi checked her watch with casual precision.
The meeting convenes in 12 minutes, Captain. I suggest you compose yourself and think very carefully about what you want to say when given the opportunity to speak.
Her tone was professional, almost kind, which somehow made everything worse. If she'd been angry, if she'd yelled or threatened, Derek might have found solid ground to stand on, might have felt justified in his defenses. But her calm professionalism highlighted the contrast with his own behavior, made it impossible to claim he'd been provoked or treated unfairly. She was giving him exactly what he'd denied her: courtesy, respect, the assumption of professional capability. The fact that he'd failed so spectacularly to extend the same to her hung in the air like poison gas choking him. The walk to the executive floor felt like a death march. Derek followed Naomi and Philip to the elevators, rode up 32 floors, in silence so heavy it felt physical, stepped out into hallways he'd never been permitted to access, despite his 2 decades with the company. The executive level was elegant in understated ways, with artwork on the walls and carpets so thick it muffled footsteps, everything designed to project success and authority. Under different circumstances, Derek might have felt proud to be invited here, might have interpreted it as recognition of his value to the company. Now it felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. A crisp young woman in business attire greeted them with professional courtesy, directed them to the main conference room, and held the door open. Derek took a breath that felt like inhaling broken glass and walked through. The conference room was impressive, dominated by a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline. Seated around that table were 11 people, the complete board of directors for Skybridge Airways, including CEO Marcus Brennan at one end. Marcus was 55, gray-haired and distinguished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Derek's monthly salary, and his expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was working very hard to maintain control. Next to Marcus sat Helen Winters, the Director of Human Resources, a stern woman in her early 60s, who looked at Derek with something approaching disgust. The other board members, a mix of financial executives, industry veterans, and investors, watched Derek enter with varying degrees of curiosity and disapproval. At the head of the table, in the position of ultimate authority, sat Naomi Caldwell. She'd removed her pilot's jacket, sat now in just her white uniform shirt, looking every inch the successful executive she clearly was. "Please sit, Captain Hammond," Naomi said, gesturing to a single empty chair positioned directly across from her. Derek sat feeling like a student called before the principal, except the stakes were infinitely higher than detention or suspension. Marcus Brennan cleared his throat. "Miss Caldwell has briefed us on the incident this morning. Before we proceed, I want to ensure we have complete understanding of events."
"Captain Hammond, do you dispute that you refused to fly with First Officer Caldwell based on your assessment of her qualifications?" Derek's mouth was dry as sand. I had concerns about crew compatibility and—" "Did you or did you not refuse to fly with her?" Marcus pressed. Derek swallowed hard.
"Yes.
But I didn't know who she was, I thought." "What you thought is irrelevant to whether your refusal constituted discrimination." Helen Winters interrupted sharply. "The question is whether you would have raised the same concerns about a white male first officer with identical credentials." Derek had no answer that wouldn't condemn him further, so he said nothing. Naomi leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "Before we discuss consequences, I want Captain Hammond and everyone in this room to understand exactly what happened this morning and why it matters." Captain Hammond looked at me and saw my race and gender before he saw anything else. He made immediate assumptions about my competence, my qualifications, and my right to be in that cockpit based solely on those characteristics. When I presented my credentials, he dismissed them. When I offered to demonstrate my skills, he refused. Instead, he publicly stated that I was likely a diversity hire, that standards had been lowered to accommodate me, and that I represented a safety risk to passengers. Naomi's voice remained calm and factual, but the words laid out Derek's actions with brutal clarity. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, wasn't a misunderstanding or miscommunication. This was textbook racial discrimination witnessed by multiple employees, and it reflects a pattern of behavior that's been tolerated in this company for far too long. Naomi pulled up a presentation on the large screen at one end of the conference room. It showed Derek's photograph and his personnel file, including every complaint he'd filed, every note in his record, every disciplinary action or lack thereof. Captain Hammond has filed 7 formal complaints about copilots in 20 years. Every single one was about a woman or person of color. Every single one was investigated and found to be without merit. In each case, the airline quietly resolved the situation to avoid conflict, moved the affected pilots to different assignments, and allowed Captain Hammond to continue without consequences because he was considered too valuable to Bendis. Discipline. Naomi's eyes were hard now, her composure cracking just enough to show the anger beneath. Do you know what message that sent? It told those pilots that their experiences didn't matter, that racism and sexism would be tolerated if the perpetrator was senior enough or valuable enough. It told other employees that the company prioritized protecting status quo power structures over protecting marginalized people from discrimination. It created a culture where someone like Captain Hammond could operate for 20 years believing he had the right to reject colleagues based on race without facing meaningful accountability. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. Several board members looked uncomfortable shifting in their seats because Naomi wasn't just condemning Derek, she was condemning the system that had enabled him, which implicated everyone with oversight responsibility. Marcus Brennan's jaw was tight, clearly recognizing his own failures of leadership in allowing this pattern to persist. Helen Winters was taking notes, her pen moving rapidly across her legal pad, already preparing for the HR nightmare this would create. Derek sat frozen, watching his entire career, his reputation, his future, being dissected and destroyed by someone he'd dismissed as unqualified just an hour earlier. The irony of that was almost physically painful. Naomi Caldwell possessed more education, more experience, more capability, and vastly more power than Derek had ever achieved, and his inability to see that because of her race had revealed him as exactly the kind of person he'd always denied being. Helen Winters opened a folder that had been sitting in front of her, adjusted her reading glasses, and began to speak in a tone that suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation for a long time. Captain Hammond, I've served as Director of Human Resources for Skybridge Airways for 11 years. In that time, I've processed your 7 formal complaints about first officers, and each time I recommended further action, further investigation into whether these complaints represented a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Each time I was overruled by executive management who insisted that your value to the company outweighed the concerns about bias. She glanced at Marcus, who had the grace to look ashamed. I want to revisit those cases now on the record so everyone understands the full scope of what we're discussing. Helen pulled up the first case on the screen. 2008. Captain Jamal Foster, an African-American pilot with 6,000 hours of flight time, impeccable safety record graduate of the Air Force Academy. You filed a complaint alleging that Captain Foster showed insufficient focus and discipline during a flight you supervised. Investigation revealed that Captain Foster had followed all protocols exactly that. The only deviation from standard procedure had actually been initiated by you, and that your complaint appeared to be triggered by Captain Foster questioning one of your decisions during pre-flight briefing, something well within a first officer's rights and responsibilities. Helen looked at Derek over her glasses. Captain Foster's career advancement was delayed by 18 months. Due to the cloud of investigation hanging over him. He eventually left Skybridge for another airline, where he's now a senior training captain earning significantly more than he would have here. She moved to the next case, 2010. First Officer Priya Desai, a woman of Indian descent, 4,000 hours flight time, dual degrees in aerospace engineering and aviation management. You complained that she failed to follow standard protocols and showed concerning gaps in technical knowledge. Investigation found that Officer Desai had performed flawlessly, that she'd actually corrected a potential error you'd made in fuel calculations, and that your complaint seemed retaliatory for her having spoken up about that error. Helen's voice hardened. Officer Desai filed her own complaint about a hostile work environment created by your treatment of her. That complaint was settled confidentially, with a payment to Officer Desai funded by this company because we chose to protect you rather than address the real problem. Case after case, Helen went through them methodically. First, Officer Carlos Mendez, dismissed by Derek as having language barriers, despite being fully bilingual and holding international certifications. First Officer Lin Chen, accused of being too inexperienced, despite having more simulator hours than Derek himself. First Officer Sarah Mitchell, one of the few white pilots Derek had complained about, but Helen noted that Sarah was openly gay, and Derek's complaint had included uncomfortable references to whether she could handle the stress of flying. Given her personal life, each story revealed the same pattern: highly qualified pilots of color, women, or LGBTQ individuals being subjected to Derek's scrutiny and complaints, while white heterosexual men with similar or lesser qualifications sailed through. Without question, each story represented a career, damaged opportunities, lost pain and frustration endured because one man's prejudices had been tolerated and enabled by a company more concerned with avoiding conflict than ensuring justice. By the time Helen finished, Derek felt physically ill. Hearing the cases laid out this way, seeing the pattern made explicit, forced him to confront what he'd spent years denying even to himself. He'd always told himself his complaints were legitimate, that he was just maintaining standards, that he happened to notice more problems with certain pilots because those pilots actually had more problems. But stripped of his rationalizations and excuses, the truth was undeniable. He'd targeted people who didn't look like him, who didn't fit his narrow conception of what a pilot should be, and he'd used his position and authority to make their lives harder for no reason other than bias and prejudice. The word racist, which Naomi had applied to him earlier, and which he'd vehemently rejected, settled over him now with the weight of undeniable truth. He was exactly what he'd insisted he wasn't. Naomi let the silence stretch after Helen finished, let the weight of that history press down on everyone in the room. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "This is why I bought this airline. Not for profit, though. I expect it will be profitable. Not as a vanity project or a hobby. I bought Skybridge because I've lived the experiences of every pilot Derek Hammond targeted. I know what it's like to be the only woman in a squadron, the only black face in a briefing room, the only person who has to prove themselves twice as hard to receive half the recognition. I flew F-16 fighter jets for the United States Air Force for 10 years, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for actions in combat, graduated top of my class from every training program I ever attended, and I still encountered people who looked at me and saw only my race and gender, who assumed I was filling quotas rather than earning positions through merit." She stood, walked to the windows, looked out at the sky, where planes were taking off and landing in steady rhythm. "After I left the military, I built a career in investment and private equity. I was good at it, good enough to accumulate $700 million in assets by age 35. But I never forgot. Aviation never stopped flying, never lost the love of being in a cockpit. 3 months ago, when Skybridge became available for purchase, I saw an opportunity to create something different. An airline where talent would be recognized regardless of packaging, where diversity wouldn't be a box to check, but a genuine strength, where people like Captain Hammond couldn't operate unchallenged for 20 years, while destroying other people's dreams and careers." Naomi turned back to face the table. "So let's be very clear about what happened this morning. Captain Hammond didn't just insult me personally, though he certainly did that. He revealed a systemic problem in this organization, a cancer that's been allowed to grow because it was easier to accommodate one man's bigotry than to confront it and remove it." Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Miss Caldwell, I don't know what to say. You're right. About all of it. I've been telling myself lies for so long that I believed them." He looked up, met her eyes for the first time, with something like genuine honesty. "I grew up in Alabama in the 70s. My father taught me that different people had different places in the world, that some were naturally suited for leadership and others weren't, and he based those judgments on race and gender. I never questioned it, never examined it, just absorbed it and carried it with me into every part of my life. Derek's voice strengthened slightly as he forced himself to continue. I'm not offering that as an excuse, just as explanation. I've been wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. I've heard people who didn't deserve it, damaged careers, represented exactly the kind of thinking that holds everyone back. And I'm sorry. That doesn't fix anything, doesn't undo the harm, but I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air and several board members exchanged glances. It was more honesty than anyone had expected from Derek, more self-awareness than seemed possible given how he'd behaved just hours earlier. But Naomi's expression didn't soften. Captain Hammond, I appreciate the admission genuinely. It's more than many people in your position would offer. But apologies don't erase consequences, and they don't solve systemic problems. The question now is what happens next. Naomi returned to her seat at the head of the table, her expression thoughtful and controlled. Derek braced himself for the inevitable, for the termination that he knew he deserved, for the destruction of everything he'd built. Part of him almost wanted it, wanted the clean ending, the punishment that would match his crimes and allow him to slink away and try to forget. But Naomi Caldwell wasn't interested in giving him easy endings. Captain Hammond, she said, her voice carrying that same calm authority that seemed to be her default mode, I have the power to fire you right now. Immediate termination, no severance, no pension benefits, despite your 20 years of service, no letter of recommendation, nothing. Your career in aviation would be over, your reputation destroyed, and you would deserve every bit of it based on your actions and the pattern of behavior we've documented. Derek nodded miserably. I understand. I accept. I'm not finished, Naomi interrupted. I said I could fire you. I didn't say I was going to. The words hit Derek like cold water, shocking him out of his resignation. He looked up, confused, saw similar confusion on the faces of several board members. Marcus Brennan leaned forward, clearly wondering where Naomi was going with this. Helen Winters set down her pen, her expression shifting from stern judgment to puzzled curiosity. Naomi let the moment stretch, then continued. Firing you would be easy, satisfying, even in a short-term way. It would send a message that racism won't be tolerated in this organization. But it would also be incomplete, because it wouldn't address the real problem. She stood again, pacing now as she talked, energy building in her voice. The real problem isn't just Derek Hammond. The real problem is a culture that created Derek Hammond, that enabled him, that protected him, that told him his behavior was acceptable for 20 years. Firing one man doesn't change that culture. It just removes the most visible symptom while leaving the disease intact. Naomi stopped pacing, looked directly at Derek. I didn't buy this airline to punish individuals, Captain Hammond. I bought it to transform systems. And that means I need people who are willing to change, to grow, to become living examples of how transformation is possible. She let that sink in. So I'm going to offer you a choice, a real choice, with real consequences either way. You can choose option 1, resign today with a neutral reference letter, keep your pension, and walk away. No public scandal, no formal termination, just a quiet exit that preserves whatever dignity you have left. That's the easy path, the path that lets you escape without really facing what you've done or becoming better. Derek listened, barely breathing. Naomi continued. Or you can choose option 2, stay but under conditions so strict that any violation means immediate termination. You'll be suspended from flying for 6 months without pay, during which you'll undergo intensive diversity and anti-racism training, 4 hours per week with licensed professionals. You'll work with HR to review every complaint you've filed, and you'll write personal letters of apology to every pilot you targeted, acknowledging specifically what you did wrong and how it affected them. When you return to flying, you'll be under probationary status for 2 years with regular evaluations and zero tolerance for any discriminatory behavior. And here's the hardest part. You'll share your story, the real story of your racism and your journey to overcome it, in company-wide training sessions, putting your shame and growth on display to help others learn. The terms were brutal, humiliating, and demanding in ways that made immediate termination almost look appealing. But there was something else in them too. A path forward, an opportunity for redemption, a chance to become something better than what he'd been. "Why?" Derek asked hoarsely. "Why would you give me a chance after what I did to you?" Naomi's expression softened slightly, not with forgiveness but with something like understanding. "Because I believe in breaking cycles, not just punishing symptoms. If I fire you, you leave here convinced you were treated unfairly, that political correctness destroyed your career, that you were the victim. You learn nothing, change nothing, and probably spread your bitterness and prejudice to everyone who listen. But if you stay and do the hard work of actually changing, actually confronting your racism and growing past it, then maybe, just maybe, you become someone who can help others do the same." She paused. "I'm not doing this for you, Captain Hammond. I'm doing it because I believe transformed people can transform systems. And I need people in this organization who can speak authentically about confronting bias, because they've lived that journey." The room was absolutely silent. Marcus Brennan looked at Naomi with something approaching awe, clearly recognizing leadership and vision beyond anything he'd demonstrated in his own tenure. Helen Winters was nodding slowly, already making notes about how to structure the training program and probationary requirements. Other board members seemed divided between admiration for Naomi's approach and skepticism about whether Derek deserved such an opportunity. Derek himself felt tears burning behind his eyes, felt emotions churning that he couldn't name or control. He didn't deserve this chance, knew he didn't, and yet it was being offered anyway. Not out of weakness or forgiveness, but out of something more complex and challenging, a belief that people could change if given the right combination of accountability and opportunity. "I need your answer now," Naomi said. "Option 1 or option 2? Walk away or do the work?" Derek thought about his daughter Emily, who'd tried for years to talk to him about these issues, who worked for a racial justice nonprofit, and who'd grown increasingly distant as she recognized her father's prejudices. He thought about the pilots he'd hurt, careers he'd damaged, pain he'd caused, because he couldn't see past his own biases. He thought about who he'd been that morning, so certain of his righteousness, so blind to his own failings. And he thought about who he might become if he actually did the work, actually confronted the ugly truths about himself and grew past them. "Option 2, he said, his voice cracking. "I choose option 2. I want to change. I want to be better. I want to earn the chance you're giving me." Naomi nodded, once crisp and businesslike. "Then we have an agreement. Helen will work with you on the details of your training program and probation terms. You're suspended effective immediately, and you'll begin the diversity training next Monday." She looked around the table at the board members. "This concludes the emergency session. Captain Hammond, you're dismissed. I suggest you go home, think deeply about the commitment you just made, and prepare yourself for 6 months of very difficult, very uncomfortable work." Derek stood on shaky legs, nodded to the room, and walked out, feeling like he'd just been given both a death sentence and a second chance at life, unable to tell which would be harder to live with. The first month of suspension was the hardest thing Derek had ever endured, and he'd survived military training, emergency landings, and 2 decades of high-pressure commercial aviation. But none of that compared to the psychological and emotional challenge of confronting his own prejudices, examining the beliefs he'd held his entire life, and recognizing how much harm he'd caused to people who'd done nothing to deserve it. His first session with Dr. Amara Johnson, a black psychologist who specialized in racial bias and diversity training, began with her asking a simple question: "Why are you here?" Derek had started with the corporate answer, the safe answer, "Because it's a requirement of my continued employment." Dr. Johnson had smiled sadly and said, "Try again. Why are you really here?" It took Derek 3 sessions before he could honestly answer, "Because I'm a racist and I need to change." The training sessions happened twice a week, 2 hours each, in a small conference room that felt simultaneously too large and too small for the work they were doing. Dr. Johnson didn't let Derek hide behind euphemisms or excuses.
When he tried to explain his behavior as product of his upbringing, she asked why he'd never questioned that upbringing as an adult. When he claimed he didn't mean to be hurtful, she pointed out that impact mattered more than intent. When he insisted he wasn't that bad compared to violent racists, she made him watch his own behavior from that morning, captured on airport security cameras, and asked him how the hatred in his eyes looked any different from more overt forms of racism. The sessions were exhausting, emotionally draining, and often left Derek in tears, but they were also slowly, painfully effective. He began to see how white supremacy had structured his entire worldview, how he'd benefited from unearned advantages his entire life while convincing himself everything he'd achieved was purely through merit, how his comfort had been purchased at the expense of others' pain. Dr. Johnson assigned reading that Derek worked through with the diligence he'd once applied to flight manuals, histories of racism in America, autobiographies of civil rights leaders, academic papers on unconscious bias, and structural on-flighters discrimination. He read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and felt his understanding of racial justice completely restructured. He read Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me, and finally began to grasp what it meant to move through the world in a black body constantly aware of dangers and judgments that Derek had never had to consider. He read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and realized that not being actively racist wasn't enough, that he needed to actively work against racism to truly change. Each book felt like removing another layer of comfortable ignorance, exposing truths he'd spent 52 years avoiding. The letter writing proved even harder than the reading. Helen Winters provided Derek with contact information for the 7 pilots he'd filed complaints against, and Derek had to craft individual specific apologies to each one. He couldn't use templates or generic language. Each letter had to address exactly what he'd done, acknowledge the specific harm caused, and take full responsibility without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. His letter to Jamal Foster went through 11 drafts before Dr. Johnson approved it each revision, stripping away more self-justification and defensiveness until only honest accountability remained. Captain Foster had finally read, "I filed a complaint against you in 2008 that was completely without merit and motivated entirely by racial bias. You had done nothing wrong. In fact, you had performed excellently. My complaint delayed your career advancement by 18 months and likely caused you significant emotional distress. I did this because I saw your race before I saw your qualifications, and I let prejudice override professionalism and fairness. I am deeply sorry for the harm I caused you. You deserved better from me and from this industry. I am working to become a person who would never again treat someone as I treated you." Jamal's response came 3 weeks later. "It was brief, Derek. I appreciate the apology. What you did hurt not just professionally but personally, because it reminded me that no matter how qualified I became, some people would always see my skin color first. Your complaint wasn't the only racism I faced in aviation, but it was one of the more painful instances because it came from someone I'd tried to respect. An apology can't give me back those 18 months or erase that pain. But if you're genuinely changing, if you're becoming someone who fights against racism instead of perpetuating it, then maybe something good can come from something bad. I hope you're serious about this work, because the industry needs more people willing to actually change." Derek read that letter a dozen times, feeling the weight of Jamal's measured hope and guarded optimism, understanding that he'd have to prove through actions, not just words, that his transformation was real. By month 3, Derek's understanding of racism had fundamentally shifted. He'd started the training thinking racism was about individual hatred and explicit discrimination, the N-word, and segregated water fountains, things he'd never personally engaged in, and therefore convinced himself he wasn't racist. Now he understood racism as a system, a structure woven through every institution in American society, benefiting people like him in ways so normalized he'd never noticed them. He recognized how he'd gotten his first pilot job partly through connections his white father had in the aviation community, connections that came from social networks built on residential segregation and exclusive country clubs that didn't admit people of color. He saw how his military career had been easier because he'd never faced the additional burden of proving he deserved to be there.
Never had his mistakes attributed to his entire race. Never been questioned about diversity quotas. He understood how his success at Skybridge had been built partially on the systematic exclusion of competitors who weren't given the same opportunities or who were pushed out by hostile environments like the one he'd helped create. The most transformative moment came during month 4, when Dr. Johnson brought in 3 current Skybridge pilots of color to share their experiences with Derek directly. One was a black woman named Simone Wright, a first officer who'd been with the airline for 5 years. Simone described being constantly mistaken for a flight attendant, having passengers refuse to believe she was actually a pilot, hearing comments about affirmative action every time she achieved anything, working twice as hard as white colleagues for half the recognition. She talked about the exhaustion of it, the constant vigilance required, the way she had to carefully manage her appearance and demeanor to seem non-threatening, the loneliness of being one of only a handful of black women pilots in the entire industry. As Derek listened to Simone, something inside him cracked open. This was the world he'd contributed to creating, the burden he'd helped impose, the pain he'd been part of causing. He'd complained about having to work with one black co-pilot for one flight, while Simone and others like her navigated predominantly white spaces every single day of their careers, facing skepticism and discrimination as routine. Background radiation. "I'm sorry," Derek said, when Simone finished, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm sorry for being part of the system that makes your job harder. I'm sorry for every assumption I made, every complaint I filed, every time I made someone feel like they didn't belong. I can't undo any of it, but I swear I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure other pilots of color have an easier path than you've had." Simone studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I hope you mean that, Captain Hammond, because we need allies. We need white pilots, especially white male pilots, with seniority and respect to stand up and say that racism in aviation is unacceptable. We can't fight this battle alone. It's too big, too entrenched. If you're serious about being part of the solution instead of part of the problem, that could actually matter." Those words became Derek's guiding light for the remainder of his suspension. By month 6, Derek was a different person than the man who'd refused to fly with Naomi Caldwell. Not perfect, still carrying biases that would take years more work to fully dismantle, but fundamentally changed in his understanding and commitment. He'd reached out to Emily, his daughter, and shared honestly what he'd done and what he was learning. Emily had cried on the phone, telling him she'd spent years watching him dismiss her concerns about racial justice years, feeling like her father's values were incompatible with her own. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said. "Not because you're perfect now, but because you're willing to change, willing to admit you were wrong. That takes courage." Derek had cried too, realizing how close he'd come to losing his daughter's respect completely, how his prejudices had poisoned even his closest relationships. When Derek met with Naomi for his 6-month evaluation, he walked into her office as a genuinely humble man rather than the arrogant captain who dismissed her half a year earlier. Naomi gestured to a chair, and they sat across from each other in the late afternoon light filtering through her windows. "Dr. Johnson sent me her final assessment," Naomi said. "She believes your commitment to change is genuine, that you've done serious internal work, and that you're ready to return to flying with appropriate oversight." Naomi paused. "But I want to hear from you directly. Have you changed, Captain Hammond? Or have you just learned what to say to keep your job?" Derek met her eyes. 6 months ago, I would have said the right words to protect myself and believed I meant them while planning to go back to business as usual. Today, I can tell you honestly that I've changed in ways I'm still discovering. I've learned that I was racist, that I benefited from and perpetuated systems of racial oppression, that I hurt people who deserved better. I've learned that I have a responsibility to use whatever privilege and platform I have to fight against racism instead of ignoring it or contributing to it. And I've learned that this work never ends, that I'll be learning and growing for the rest of my life. Naomi studied him, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "All right, I'm authorizing your return to flight status effective 2 weeks from today. You'll be assigned to work with our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and you'll begin sharing your story with new pilot recruits as part of their orientation." She handed him a folder. "Inside, you'll find your new flight schedule and the names of first officers you'll be flying with. Several of them are women and pilots of color who've requested to work with you specifically because they want to see if your change is real. Derek opened the folder, saw names and faces, felt both nervous and honored. I won't let them down, he said. I won't let you down. Naomi's expression softened just slightly. Don't do it for me, Captain Hammond. Do it because it's right. 2 weeks later, Derek stood in the crew briefing room preparing for his first flight since the suspension, and his stomach churned with nerves he hadn't felt since his very first solo flight decades ago. Everything felt different now, charged with meaning and consequence that went far beyond simply moving an aircraft from point A to point B. The door opened and Naomi Caldwell walked in wearing her pilot's uniform, and Derek's first thought was how completely he'd misjudged her 6.5 months ago, how his prejudice had blinded him to the remarkable person standing before him. Good morning, Captain Hammond, Naomi said with professional warmth. Ready for our flight. This was Naomi's idea. Derek knew a symbolic full-circle moment where they would finally fly together as they should have done that morning in May. London was the destination. Again, the same route, the same aircraft type, but everything else was different. Good morning, First Officer Caldwell, Derek responded, and this time when he extended his hand, it was with genuine respect and gratitude. It's an honor to fly with you. They shook hands firmly, and Derek saw acknowledgement in Naomi's eyes, recognition that he'd traveled a long, difficult road to reach this moment. They worked through the pre-flight preparation together, and Derek made a point of asking for Naomi's input, listening to her suggestions, treating her as the highly skilled professional she was. When she pointed out a more efficient routing option, Derek immediately agreed and updated the flight plan. When she mentioned a weather system they should monitor, Derek thanked her for the heads up and incorporated it into their briefing. The collaboration was seamless, exactly what flying should be when two competent pilots work together without the poison of prejudice interfering. As they walked to the aircraft, Derek noticed other pilots watching, aware that this flight carried significance beyond its scheduled route. Some looked supportive, others skeptical, waiting to see if Derek's transformation would last or fade once the spotlight shifted. Derek understood their doubt. He'd given them plenty of reasons to question whether a man could truly change so fundamentally. All he could do was prove, through consistent action over time, that his commitment was real. In the cockpit, as they ran through checklists and prepared for pushback, Derek felt a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. This was what aviation was supposed to be. Skilled people working together, united by competence and professionalism, not divided by arbitrary characteristics like race or gender. The flight itself was flawless. They took off into clear skies, climbed to cruising altitude over the Atlantic, and settled into the routine of monitoring instruments, communicating with air traffic control, and making minor adjustments to their course. At one point, about 3 hours into the flight, Derek broke the comfortable silence. Can I ask you something personal? He said. Naomi glanced over, nodded. When you walked into that briefing room 6 months ago and saw my reaction, knew immediately that I was judging you based on race, what did you feel? Naomi was quiet for a moment, considering anger, she finally said. Disappointment, though. I wasn't surprised because it happens more often than white people realize. But also, something else. Determination. Because I had the power to hold you accountable in ways that previous victims of your prejudice didn't, and I was going to use that power to create change. Derek nodded slowly. I've thought about that morning so many times. The look on your face when I refused to shake your hand, when I questioned your qualifications, when I said all those terrible things. You stayed so calm, so professional, even though I was treating you with complete disrespect. He paused, struggling to articulate what he meant. How did you not just lose it, not tell me off, or walk away? Naomi smiled slightly. Oh, I wanted to. Believe me, I wanted to. But I learned a long time ago that responding to racism with anger, however justified, often just confirms stereotypes and gives people like you an excuse to dismiss me as emotional or unprofessional. So I stay calm, I document everything, and I wait for the right moment to respond effectively. She looked at Derek. Besides, I could see that you were about to destroy yourself, far more thoroughly than I ever could. Sometimes, the best response to someone revealing their prejudice is just to let them keep talking. Derek winced at the memory of his own arrogance. I was so certain I was right, so convinced that you couldn't possibly be qualified. Looking back, I can't believe how blind I was, how I mistook prejudice for professional judgment." He shook his head. "The training over the past 6 months showed me that I've been carrying racist assumptions my entire life. Assumptions so deep I didn't even recognize them as assumptions. I thought they were just facts about how the world worked." Naomi nodded. "That's how systemic racism operates. It normalizes itself so completely that people perpetuating it don't see themselves as racist because they compare themselves to extremists rather than examining their own biases. You're not unique in that, Derek. You're actually pretty typical of how many white people move through the world, benefiting from racial hierarchies while being completely unaware of them or their role in maintaining them. They flew in thoughtful silence for a while, the ocean stretching endlessly beneath them, the curve of the earth visible at the horizon." Derek felt the weight of his past and the possibility of his future balanced against each other. "What made you decide to give me a second chance?" he asked. "You could have just fired me, made an example of me, and nobody would have questioned it. Why invest the time and energy in trying to change someone like me?" Naomi considered the question carefully. "Because firing you would have been satisfying, but ultimately limited in impact. You would have left probably felt victimized, and the culture that created you would have remained intact. But if you could actually change, actually transform from someone who perpetuated racism to someone who fought against it that could influence the culture itself, transformed people can transform systems, Derek. That's what I'm betting on." As they began their descent into London, Derek reflected on how different this flight was from what would have happened 6 months ago if he'd been forced to fly with Naomi. Then, he would have been watching her like a hawk, waiting for any mistake to confirm his prejudices, creating a hostile environment through his suspicion and doubt. Now he trusted her completely, recognized her superior skills in several areas, and felt grateful to learn from her experience. The difference wasn't in Naomi. She'd been exactly this competent and professional all along. The difference was in Derek's ability to see her clearly without the distorting lens of racial bias. They landed smoothly at Heathrow, taxied to the gate, and completed their post-flight procedures. As they gathered their materials to leave the cockpit, Derek turned to Naomi. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the chance, for the faith that I could change, for not giving up on me when I deserved it. I know I'll spend years making up for the harm I caused, and I'm committed to that work." Naomi smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "You're welcome, Derek. But remember, you're not doing this to repay me. You're doing it because it's right, and because people who come after you deserve better than what we've had." They walked through the airport together, and Derek noticed other crew members watching, some with curiosity, others with approval. Word had spread about Derek's transformation, about the intensive training and genuine change, and people were cautiously optimistic that real progress was possible. 3 months later, Derek stood in front of a room full of new pilot recruits for Skybridge Airways, preparing to share his story as part of their mandatory diversity training. His hands were shaking slightly as he looked at the faces before him, a genuinely diverse group of aspiring pilots, representing different races, genders, and backgrounds. This was what aviation's future could look like if people like him stopped standing in the way. "My name is Captain Derek Hammond," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And I'm going to tell you about the worst mistake of my career, the day I let racism destroy nearly everything I'd built, and what I've learned since then about being better." He told them the whole story, sparing himself nothing, describing his prejudices and the harm they'd caused with unflinching honesty. Some of the recruits looked uncomfortable, others angry, a few were nodding with recognition of experiences they'd had themselves. When Derek finished, a young black woman raised her hand. "Captain Hammond, how do we know your change is real? How do we know this isn't just a performance to keep your job?" It was a fair question, the same one Derek would have asked in her position. He met her eyes. "You don't know, not for certain. All I can tell you is that I show up every day, committed to being better than I was yesterday, to examining my biases and working against them, to using whatever privilege and platform I have to make this industry more equitable. You'll have to judge me by my actions over time, not by my words today." But I hope you'll give me the chance to prove that people can change, that racism isn't permanent or inevitable, and that we can build something better together." The young woman studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I hope you're right, Captain. Because we need allies, and actions matter more than apologies." A year after the incident that had nearly destroyed him, Derek stood with Naomi in her office, reviewing the latest diversity metrics for Skybridge Airways. The airline had increased its percentage of pilots of color by 17%, added comprehensive anti-bias training for all employees, and implemented strict accountability measures for discrimination. The culture was changing slowly but genuinely, and Derek had become one of the most vocal advocates for that change. "We still have a long way to go," Naomi said, looking at the reports, "but this is real progress, the kind that creates lasting transformation rather than just checking boxes." Derek nodded. "I never imagined I'd be part of creating this kind of change. A year ago, I was part of the problem. Now I get to be part of the solution. And that's a gift I don't take for granted." Naomi smiled at him. "You know what the best part is? The pilots you used to file complaints against the ones whose careers you tried to damage. Several of them have told me that seeing your transformation gives them hope that the industry really can change." That's the power of genuine redemption, Derek. It doesn't erase the harm, but it creates possibility. Derek felt emotion tighten his throat. That people he'd hurt could find anything positive in his journey humbled him beyond words. "I'll spend the rest of my career trying to deserve that grace," he said. Naomi stood, walked to the window where they could see planes taking off and landing, the constant movement of an industry in motion. "The sky belongs to everyone, Derek. It took us both a long journey to fully understand that, but now we get to make sure future generations don't have to fight as hard to claim their place among the clouds." So here's my final question for you. Do you believe people can truly change? Have you seen transformation like Derek's in your own life? Or do you think some prejudices are too deep to overcome? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And let's have a real conversation about redemption, accountability, and the ongoing work of building a more just world. If this story moved, you hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel because we're committed to telling stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us that change is always possible if we're willing to do the work. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. May we all have the courage to confront our own biases, the humility to admit when we're wrong, and the determination to become better than we were yesterday. Until next time, keep flying toward justice. This story teaches us that racism isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it wears a uniform and hides behind professionalism. Derek Hammond's prejudice cost careers, damaged lives, and perpetuated systems of discrimination for 20 years because organizations prioritized comfort over justice. The most powerful lesson here is that accountability and transformation are both possible when those with power choose courage over convenience. Naomi Caldwell didn't just punish racism. She created pathways for genuine change by demanding Derek confront his biases and rebuild himself from the inside out. Her decision reminds us that justice isn't only about consequences, but about breaking cycles that harm entire communities. We learn that privilege becomes visible only when we're willing to examine it honestly, that good intentions don't erase harmful impacts, and that real change requires sustained, uncomfortable work. Derek's journey shows that people can transform if they acknowledge their failures without excuse, listen to those they've harmed, and commit to lifelong growth. Most importantly, this story proves that creating equitable spaces demands more than policy changes. It requires individuals willing to use their positions to dismantle the very systems that elevated them. True allyship means accepting correction, amplifying marginalized voices, and understanding that redemption is measured not in apologies, but in consistent action toward justice. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone genuinely transform after confronting their prejudices, or do you believe Derek got off too easy? What would you have done in Naomi's position? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter. If this story challenged you to examine your own biases or inspired you to believe that change is possible, smash that like button right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that make us think deeply about justice, redemption, and the ongoing fight for equality. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that accountability and grace can coexist, that transformation is hard but necessary, and that we all have roles to play in creating fairer systems. Thank you for watching, for engaging thoughtfully, and for being part of a community that believes people and systems can become better. May you always have the courage to confront injustice, the wisdom to recognize your own blind spots, and the determination to build a world where everyone truly belongs. Keep questioning, keep growing, and keep fighting for what's right. Until next time, fly toward justice and never stop reaching for the sky.